Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Kafka's Talks. We have guest Arakel Minassian, who is a graduate of the MA program in Russian, East European, and Euro-Asian Studies at the University of Michigan, where he wrote his thesis on Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in contemporary Eastern Armenian literature. Arakel is also a translator of both Western and Eastern Armenian. Hello, Arakel. We're happy to see you here. And I start my first question. I would like to know about your personal interest in actually Armenian literature and specifically literature about Armenian and Azerbaijan relationships. And what is your background and your personal motivation or family history behind it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my motivation behind specifically working on the Karabakh conflict.
Yes, of course, and Karabakh conflict and also specifically doing Eastern Armenian literature.
Yeah. So I'm Armenian, of course, and so Armenian literature was always something that was extremely interesting to me, or something that I wanted to know more about, especially someone living in the diaspora and someone who wasn't really exposed to Armenian literature a lot when I was younger. And the way I kind of got into doing or working on literary pieces on the Karabakh conflict specifically was kind of some ways completely randomly, but also some ways just a product of my upbringing. The Karabakh conflict was always something really important. I mean, in I think most Armenians' minds, including in the diaspora, and so I grew up with the stories of the Karabakh conflict, and the kind of place where I started to think about it a little bit more was, or think about it maybe a bit more critically, was when the first time that I learned about Monte Melkonian, who was one of the people from the Armenian diaspora who actually went to Karabakh to fight with the Armenians during the war, and his brother wrote a book about his life called My Brother's Road. And the interesting part of that book was that it kind of gave the whole story of Melkonian's life, but it also talked about parts of the Karabakh conflict that I think we in the Armenian diaspora maybe brushed over or didn't really look at. Like, for example, in the book, he spoke about massacres of Azerbaijani civilians and also expulsion of the Azerbaijanis from in and around the territories surrounding Karabakh, but also from within Karabakh, places like Kalbajar. So that was where I kind of started to question more, okay, this was a victory for the Armenians, and a kind of fight for self-determination. But I also wanted to find out more about these complex aspects of it, these aspects of it that weren't spoken about in the diaspora. And so that kind of really drove home for me, actually, when I visited Armenia in 2018. And at that time, I was with the Birthright Armenia program, which is this internship program where basically they ask diasporans to come to Armenia and to do kind of various types of internship or volunteer work. And I was marking hiking trails in and around Karabakh. And so one of the places that we actually hiked through was Kelbajar. And so that was kind of a big, again, questioning period for me, because I saw, all of these empty homes and this, the Azerbaijani part of the city that was kind of completely abandoned. So it just kind of, these things like this kind of got me asking myself more questions about the nuances in the stories that we told about the Karabakh conflict.
Yes.
And so the way that kind of came into literature later was because literature was my academic background, and so it was kind of the natural starting point for me to ask these sorts of questions.
Yeah, I think actually this is a really good hint for go through about our second question, that because yeah, in this sense we could see like you met some like a critical point of view about this conflict that all we have our mind about like stereotypes or like this. So you met some critical point of, and you start to questioning about these things. So in like following this the statement like how you choose your novels, like let's say as a case selection of your research, and which their most what's their most appealing features of this selection that bring to you the motivation have doing your research on this.
Right. Yeah.
What was there actually the messages, and what and in which way they express these conflicts actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So I actually came across. I think like in research, this is usually how it is, but I kind of came across my texts somewhat randomly. But the things that I found so, I guess, interesting and enticing about them was that they both looked at the Karabakh conflict kind of outside of the dominant national narrative that we have in Armenia. And so just to tell you a little bit about them, the first is a short story by Hambartsumyan. It's called Yergujam, which means 2 hours. And that short story is about a young Armenian soldier who's on guard duty during the kind of stagnant phase of the conflict, before the latest fighting we saw this year. And he's a conscript in the army. As I'm not sure how it is in Azerbaijan, but in Armenia there's mandatory conscription for people over 18, I believe.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
so.
right, yeah. And so this soldier is kind of on the front lines. He's doing his guard duty for that night, and he's reflecting on the suicide of a soldier who had also been on guard duty just kind of a couple of weeks earlier. And while he's contemplating that other guard's suicide, he's also contemplating his own. And so the interesting part about that story I found was that it wasn't talking about the conflict in the kind of heroic and nationalist terms that we sometimes use to talk about it, or that is, I think, most often used to talk about it. But he was rather trying to show how this war affects ordinary soldiers on the front lines who are going through it every day. And the other part that I found really interesting about it was that there's actually a moment in that story where the guard duty is kind of trying to figure out how much time is left in his duty that day, in his watch. And he says, he reflects that if his commander weren't there at the base that day, he would normally call out to the Azerbaijani soldier on the other side of the line, who's only like 50 meters away. He would call out in Russian and ask for the time. And so the really interesting part of that was that, the Azerbaijani soldier there is not depicted as an enemy, but he's depicted as someone with whom this soldier can communicate with in Russian, right? The kind of one of the vestiges of the Soviet period, when Armenia and Azerbaijan were both part of the same country. But also, what the author was pointing to, at least in my reading, is that the Armenian and the Azeri soldier in that context are kind of going through the same suffering. You know, they're both waiting on this guard duty in these trenches, kind of waiting not only for their guard duties to end, but for the war, the conflict to end. And so that was one place where I thought the author was kind of trying to break down these boundaries and show more similarities between Armenians and Azerbaijanis than differences.
Yes, like same unfortunate the human destiny or like tragedy of the war on the human lives. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and there was another book, I think, because before I watched your presentation about this your research, that there was Aterazma. It was more interesting as a more novelty. It brings even in a visual communication, to bring new aspect to this conflict, peaceful approach this conflict. And if you want to speak about it a bit also about that book, because it was really bringing literature, literary communication, and also visual communication to this conflict that it's in some case it is, we can say, maybe more effective visually to show these similarities on their duties, let's say, front line.
Yeah, of course. And so yeah, like you said, that book is called Aterazma. It's by an author, Gharslyan, who is from Armenia, but he lives in the United States, and he wrote that book from the United States, published it in 2016, right after the April War in 2016. And so, like you said, that book is a visual. It's not a traditional novel or collection of short stories or anything, but it's a visual piece that he actually calls the Bakrain film, which translates as typographic film, kind of like a film in letters, is the best way to put it. But he also, like Hambartsumyan, he takes the position in his book of the Armenian, actually the Armenian and the Azerbaijani soldiers on the line of contact. And he kind of starts out with discussing the film, actually by Sergei Parajanov, called "The Legend of the Surami Fortress." And in that film, the main character Zurab is basically, it's a Georgian film, and the main character Zurab is basically forced to immure himself, so basically to cement himself into a wall to defend it, the fortress from invading Turks. But so Gharslyan kind of reinterprets that story so that Zurab, that boy who is being forced to be in this wall, Zurab actually represents the Armenian and the Azerbaijani soldiers on both sides of the line of contact, who he sees as kind of these unwilling sacrifices in this conflict. These young kids who are forced to fight a war that began before many of them were even born, and so he takes that kind of position, and kind of tries to show that these kids are basically just the sacrifices of this conflict.
Yeah, and what do you think about, for example, these books of the styles, or they speak like the people, or they they seem more in an elitist aspect? So how they reach to actually the like ordinary people, to society, and what's the reaction of the society actually for this book in, let's say, in Armenian society as well? If you have any information about Azerbaijani society as well, it will be
that's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good question because so I think what I would say is Hambartsumyan's piece, the short story, is very much just a traditional short story. So I think it's very accessible to a wider audience. Gharslyan's book Aterazma is I would say much less accessible as a book on its own because, and actually maybe here I can share my screen just to give viewers a sense of what I am talking about. From a talk that I recently gave on these books, but this is kind of what Gharslyan's text looks like. And I won't go into details here of analyzing this, but he represents what he's trying to say very visually like this, using words. And so in there for a minute. But so basically his book, I would say, is a lot less accessible for just a reader who picks it up. There isn't a lot of explanation in it. It's just these visual, these images that are extremely difficult to decipher. But on the other hand, I kind of hesitate to use the word elitist with regards to it, just because I don't think that was necessarily his intention. And I think after he published the book, he has tried really extremely hard to make the book accessible. So, for example, he's given numerous lectures on the book, basically where he explains kind of in detail what he's trying to do and what he's trying to say. And many of those lectures are recorded in Armenian and in English, and they're on YouTube actually. And so that was, a big help for me, because I remember the first time I picked up this book, it was I had no idea what to make of it. It was just these pages of words that didn't really seem to make any sense to me. And but once I watched one of his presentations, it was actually really easy to follow, and to be honest, extremely powerful, hearing him both describe what he was doing and what was going on in the book. So I would encourage anybody who's interested in that book to look up or to find those presentations on YouTube and watch them.
Yeah, I also like watched the lectures and the presentation about this book, that he also used Azerbaijani languages and make references to Azerbaijani like writers, and it was really impressive for me that they using the role words in a two different side of like putting Da Vinci's like human on it, and giving the space for cutting that man, and there was actually the two men that was cutting just from their and it was like the ending of their prison from that.
Exactly.
The wall I think were like symbolizing the war, the conflict in the Nagorno-Karabakh, which ended up like sacrificing like the many generations of our youth in both sides. That's why actually it was not like our intention or my intention about to say like elitist to the directly to author, but in the way of the like say express this literature, the piece of this literature, because it's using really like futuristic new way of the literature, also like making game, playing with words, like deleting or adding and having new like meanings, or getting more deeper in this the words, like in the, let's say, in the more linguistic way of, and to explaining the negatives of this war and the hate words, even So that's why I'm like wondering that how society, let's say, respond and this kind of the books, like they're more readable or they are in the marginal side.
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Hambartsumyan's is marginal, but definitely Gharslyan's is, in terms of, you're completely right, that this book was not necessarily accepted or praised, celebrated when it was published at first in Armenia. And to be honest, I'm not even necessarily sure if that was the case because of the content, like because of the anti-war content, or like you're saying, if it was mostly because it was so inaccessible. And I mean, I've talked to so many people in Armenia in writing circles, and I mean, even I've spoken with Gharslyan himself about this, and they, I would say the consensus in the literary world, in Armenia, what at first was that, oh, what is this? This isn't literature. This isn't, like, what is this trying to say? What is this trying to do? So in that sense, it was extremely marginal, and I would say it still is. I don't think people are going and buying this book at bookstores, but I do think, interestingly enough, I think now that Gharslyan has given a number of presentations on it, I think it's gained a little bit more popularity. And I know that actually during the war in that began in September, the 2020 war, I know that he was in Yerevan by chance. He was visiting Yerevan, and he gave kind of an impromptu discussion at one of the coffee shops in Yerevan, which, I mean, since I wasn't there, unfortunately, I don't exactly know what was discussed or anything, but I think he was kind of discussing this sort of anti-war message in the context of the war that had just begun again, and I even saw that they had because his book is so visual, they had actually drawn one of the images as like a mural on stairs outside of the coffee shop. So it's interesting. All of that is to say that it began, I think, as an extremely marginal text, and I think it still is, but it's also gained a little bit more popularity among intellectual and literary circles. I would say maybe even especially because of the latest fighting.
Yes, and also I'm really curious about like you said also like after the last war, let's say 2020, like if are you aware of, do you have any information about these authors who before like writing about a more peaceful approach, do they change their position or their attitudes about the conflict? Because unfortunately in Azerbaijan, like I can say that they changed their. We have like witnessed many of them before they have a talk about the peaceful resolution about the conflict and writing the piece of the, let's say, novels about it, but then they changed their positions, unfortunately. But I would like to hear from you that if you know about in Armenia, if there is.
Yeah, this was something I was also really wondering at first when the war started. How would these authors respond to the fighting? And so I'm not sure about Hambartsumyan because I don't have a personal relationship with him, but I do have a somewhat of a personal relationship with Gharslyan, the author of the second book, the visual one. And so I saw on Facebook his posts and so forth. And so I think that his position was for the most part unchanged. It's always hard to tell from Facebook posts, and I haven't had a discussion with him, so I really don't know what he was feeling in his heart. But I do know that when the statement by Azerbaijani leftist youth, the anti-war statement, came out, which I think you were a signatory to, if I'm not mistaken. He actually shared that on his Facebook page, and he that was where I found out about it for the first time, to be honest. And so in that sense, I kind of felt that his views hadn't really changed. And from his posts, again, what I could gather from his posts was more, there was a lot of pain and sadness, but I didn't see a lot of like nationalist or militarized rhetoric. So in that sense, I felt like his views hadn't really changed. Again, I can't know for sure unless I speak with him, but from what I could gather, I think that his views hadn't changed. Yeah, but I'm very curious about that. It's a very good question, and I hope I can learn more about it later.
Yeah, because in Azerbaijan we can say like only Samir left like after this war, like still unconsist about his position on this conflict. And let's follow this statement. Like, have you read any like examples of Azerbaijani like authors and writers about who writes about and this conflict and Azerbaijani and Armenian relations?
So unfortunately I haven't, and I really want to, and I think I need to, is the better way to put it. I do know of some, for example, Akram Aylisli's Stone Dreams, of course, is probably the most famous one, and Alekper Aliyev's Artushan Zaur, if I'm not mistaken, is the name. Unfortunately, I haven't read them yet, but I think it's very important to, and I would like to, at some point.
And maybe do you have any like knowledge or information about that, other Armenian writers who write on this conflict again, like Azerbaijani-Armenian relations, but let's say in different approach, in different side, and how do you compare them?
So actually, I just as you were talking, I wanted to follow up on just one point before I'll come to your question. But as Samira, you probably saw in the presentation of Gharslyan's book, I just wanted to mention one important part, which is that, as you said, there were some Azerbaijani phrases, right, in Gharslyan's book, and he had actually enlisted the help of Alekper Aliyev to translate these phrases into Azerbaijani. And so what I thought was really interesting there was that how Gharslyan was both, discussing kind of more dialogue and ways of building peace in his book, but also, in essence, kind of trying to practice it, by reaching out to an Azerbaijani author and creating that dialogue at the same time as he is talking about it. So that was just one interesting point I wanted to mention. But to come back to your question, sorry, was there something you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, no, I just want to say that ironically, like Alekper Aliyev changed his side during the war, like was a defender of the war. Like, more patriotic and nationalist way. So it was so sad.
I did not
that's
know
why
that.
actually I was wondering about like Gharslyan, the position, like how it was. So
wow, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yes, actually, this war brings very interesting like issues again. That how even the intellectuals, how deeply they understand the conflict or the ethics of the war, like and etc. So we can turn back to the question that So
Yeah.
to hear about like other Armenian writers, authors, and a different side, how they focus on this the Armenian and Azerbaijani relations and this Nagorno-Karabakh conflict.
Right. Yeah. So there's actually there's been a lot of works written on the conflict, and from like many different perspectives. Um, as as regards the most recent fighting, there has already been a lot written that, because it's so fresh, it's so recent, I can't really comment on. But even some older texts do deal with Armenian and Azerbaijani relations, and I would say the most famous and certainly the most critical, of the one that's the most critical of nationalist ideologies in both countries is probably Levon Javakhyan's short story Kirva, which was written, I believe it was published in the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. But it's pretty much one of the only short stories I know of from Armenia that actually details a massacre of Azerbaijanis in Armenia and expulsion of Azerbaijanis from Armenia during the first Karabakh War. And it also discusses the relationship between an Armenian and an Azerbaijani farmer from the Lori province in Armenia. And the Azerbaijanis are forced to leave once the war starts, but the Azerbaijani farmer had promised to send back. I think it's his best horse or something. The details I'm not sure of right now, but he basically, the story at the end of the story, he keeps his promise, and so that's one of the stories that is trying to emphasize, that Armenians and Azerbaijanis had neighborly relations before the conflict began. But it was also, again, like I think one of the only Armenian literary pieces that has actually detailed a expulsion of Azerbaijanis, and so forth. So that's one. The other stories on the Karabakh conflict that I know of don't deal so explicitly with with Armenian-Azerbaijani relations. I know that there's a very famous Armenian writer, Levon Khechoyan, who has written about he's passed away now, but he fought in the war and wrote about it. And Armenian-Azerbaijani relations kind of only come up in his texts in the sense that, I would say the Azerbaijani in the book is kind of always depicted as like he always says like they, they, the other. So it's kind of, that separation is there. I think you see. Yeah, although I actually think Khechoyan's book has many kind of critical aspects in terms of the war. It's in some ways kind of critical of the war, but in terms of Armenian-Azerbaijani relations, from what I can gather, it doesn't really kind of go beyond that, that kind of separation between the two peoples.
I would like to know about like Armenian society, like let's say more ordinary, like Armenian people, like society, how respond this the authors who have their approach like more peaceful way, more constructive, more like soft approach. So how they respond this kind of the authors. I can like give example, like in Azerbaijan, let's say Akromelisli is not like affect much more like. So,
Yeah.
and what about in Armenia? Are there like, if there's also this kind of like traitor kind of
Yeah, that's a good question. I think So I have to say that I don't know I don't know fully, like because I haven't kind of grown up with, I didn't grow up in Armenia. So and I the times that I've spent there kind of have been, I've been older, and they've been shorter times. So it's hard for me to say exactly, but I do know from what I've seen in my research and what I've heard is that that short story by Levon Javachian, um, at the outset was criticized a lot. The one that depicted good relations between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Um, but I think as time has gone on, uh, those attitudes have kind of shifted, and actually, now Levon Javachian publishes stories online. He's not kind of ostracized or anything, as far as I know. And I would say the same goes. Not to say that those anti-peace people or ideas don't exist in Armenia, because they certainly do. But I think the climate since the first war was getting more and more open, slowly. So, like, for example, Gharslyan's book, um, while not necessarily being celebrated, it wasn't like demonized or anything. Um, so, however, how those attitudes changed now with the latest fighting this year, that's, I think, another question that I don't necessarily have an answer to, and I think
Mhm.
maybe it will take some time even to see
Yes.
the
To know
effect
the
of the latest
consequences,
fighting.
yeah.
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
now the balances is like, let's say, change like vice versa. So maybe it
Yeah.
affects also like completely vice versa now.
Yeah.
And also,
Exactly.
yeah, let's jump our last question about like, do you see any like opportunities for mutual like communication and also like bringing and building mutual understanding about this conflict, like between Azerbaijani and Armenians? There is the opportunities, especially of the like in the literature, comes from the literature, like literary initiatives could play a role.
Yeah. I definitely think that they can. And actually that's, we were talking before about why I got into Armenian literature on the conflict. And it is because I firmly believe that literature has a place in peace building. I don't think that literature alone can create peace, but at its core, literature is stories, right? Stories or poems or etc. But these, I think it's so important to have stories coming out that are kind of alternate narratives to the narrative that I think Armenians and Azerbaijanis are both fed from the top, but also, that narratives that exist among society. And so what I really liked about these two texts is that they did offer these kind of different narratives. Like Hambartsumyan's story offered a picture of Armenians and Azerbaijanis as mutual people suffering in this conflict, rather than Armenians being the only ones who suffer. And Gharslyan's text similarly was trying to show that there are these two, Armenians and Azerbaijanis are these two mirror sides in the same conflict. And actually, Gharslyan's text in particular uh, asked its readers to begin this work of building mutual dialogue and of building peace. You mentioned the picture at the end of the book of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man in the book, and to explain that a little bit here, he actually I think it's worth showing the picture, because it's that picture we were referring to is this one here. So as I had mentioned, the Gharslyan kind of depicts the Armenian and Azerbaijani soldiers as being stuck, forced into these walls that separate them. And so what he asks Armenians and Azerbaijanis to do, here there's this interactive component. This Vitruvian man is pictured as a soldier. And so he actually asks his readers, there's an interactive component here with scissors, where he asks readers to cut the person out of the wall, to cut the soldier, take the soldier out of the wall. And what that does is it creates an open window, because now that the person is taken out of that page, there's an open window now where this Azerbaijani side and the Armenian side can speak with each other. So I think that Gharslyan's book is trying to do exactly that. It's trying to ask readers to kind of change how they feel about or how they think about the war and about Azerbaijanis on the other side, but also create these opportunities for dialogue. These opportunities where both sides can speak. And so yeah, I guess I see literature as having a place in these ways. Offering narratives that are different from the dominant nationalist narratives of the conflict, but also inviting readers to think about the war and the conflict in novel ways, and in ways that are more kind of attuned to peace. Of course, there will also be writers who will write extremely nationalist texts.
Yes.
So literature in that way, is it's difficult. That's the thing about it. It's difficult to say exactly who is going to write what. Yeah.
For example, more detail, what do you think, what they can do actually, the writers, the authors,
Yeah.
they really deeply and defend the peaceful approach in this conflict. And for example, I don't know, to have some institutions, projects, or for example, they start to translate books to Azerbaijani and to Armenian language. So
yeah, translation is definitely yeah, I think translation is a great place to start. The other thing I think that could be helpful is, maybe even literary conferences, where that are maybe run by independent NGOs in independent countries, where that bring writers from both countries together to share their works and discuss them. I think that's extremely important as well. But I certainly think translation, and not only translation of works that kind of fit within the specific narrative. Like, I know that Armenians were extremely excited when Akram Aylisli's Stone Dreams came out, and when it was translated into Armenian, everybody read it because it talked about massacres of Armenians. But for example, that's one of the only Azerbaijani books that has been translated into Armenian. So I would be interested to see a lot more translation of both. But also, yeah, I think these kind of maybe literary workshops, I think that could be a great way to foster dialogue as well. And yeah, I think that would be a really important thing. Just creating these kind of areas for dialogue.
We finish our question and discussion, and thank you for really interesting conversation, and thank you for accepting and coming, and thank you for everyone for listening to us.
Thank you so much, Samira. Yeah, I really appreciated the discussion.
Yeah, so